Wait, Chukwinuk, Squatwin. My name is Robert Phillips. I'm a political executive member with the First Nations Summit and the First Nations Leadership Council. We're here gathered today on Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh traditional territories. I'm just basically here to introduce everybody, and then I'll go last later on. So with that said, I will now like to send it off.
Thank you, Robert. I'm Leslie Varley. I'm the Executive Director at BC Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centres.
Good morning. I'm Cal Albright. I'm a board member at the BC Association of Friendship Centres.
At the Paid Sapyaploit Katisha Paul. My name is Katisha Paul, and I am the youth representative of UBCIC from the Quetzalcoatl, Stantliam, Lummi, and Silks Nations.
Great. Thanks, everybody. First of all, I just want to say I'm really glad to be here in front of you and to tell you this important story. I'm very deeply humbled and appreciative of the support from our political leadership, from the First Nations Summit, from the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and from the BC Assembly of First Nations. You've seen our media statement, and I'll tell you what's happened. From February 23rd to the 25th, BC Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centres hosted a membership meeting at the Hyatt Regency Hotel for staff and youth from 25 BC Friendship Centres from around the province. After dinner on Friday, February 24th, our beloved BCAAFC cultural advisor needed to use the restroom urgently while he was waiting for the elevators to go up to his room. He sought the closest available restroom where our meetings had occurred over the previous 2 days at the Hyatt Regency Hotel. He was refused access to this restroom by a Hyatt Regency employee, despite repeated pleas. After 4 requests, the cultural advisor could no longer control his need to use the toilet. This resulted in a public and humiliating incident. Onlookers witnessed the incident taking place. The cultural advisor recounts how the hotel employee mocked him and smirked at him, noticing his wet clothing. The BCAAFC cultural advisor was extremely humiliated and traumatized. The Hyatt Regency employee allowed the BCAAFC cultural advisor access to the washroom only after it was too late. After talks with the Hyatt Regency management, they have not acknowledged that this act is an act of anti-Indigenous racism and harm. The incident is a microcosm of the larger issue of systemic racism that so commonly targets Indigenous people.
Why does this happen? Canadians are hardwired for anti-Indigenous racism. Canadians have been groomed to believe stereotypes of Indigenous people. Racism has existed here for centuries and is a legacy of colonialism. There has been a conspiracy of silence about racism that targets Indigenous people because it makes people, especially white settlers, uncomfortable. Racism targeting Indigenous people is rampant, and like a contagious disease, racism will continue to infect people until it is confronted.
So I want to speak about the impact. If we've learned anything about anti-Indigenous racism, it is that racism is deadly. Racism contributes to Indigenous low self-esteem. It physically harms our bodies, our very DNA, and in particular for Indigenous youth, which is our concern, it deeply impacts youth mental health. Racism kills people. We're fortunate that this incident didn't go further. So many times we see a situation like this and it's escalated to tragedy. Racism is especially damaging to children and youth. Imagine this is your child and they witness their elder or grandfather being treated with such disrespect. Would you be okay with it? You wouldn't accept this treatment, and neither should we. What we experienced from this hotel is that it is telling Indigenous people that we don't belong in their space, even if we're paying guests. Indigenous people are treated with suspicion, And we're getting the message that we're not worthy of dignity and respect when we're treated this way.
Why should people care? Racism is intrinsically wrong. It contradicts our values as Canadians. Racism is violence and it leads to harm. We need to understand this. We have a collective responsibility to protect our children, our youth, and our elders. If we don't care about them, what does it say about our society? Refusal of a person's basic needs was the result of systemic anti-Indigenous racism and is nothing short of a human rights violation.
The reason that we're holding this press conference is because the BC Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centres is planning and has been working with this hotel for several months to put on a conference for 1,000 Indigenous youth. This is our annual conference. It's called Gathering Our Voices. It's been hosted by BCAAFC for 20 years now. It's an annual event held over spring break to celebrate Indigenous youth, their culture, and their identity. We put on hundreds of workshops, and we give youth opportunity and ideas for their future, be that schooling, trades, or straight into career. Gathering Our Voices is slated to start on the 21st of March, going into the 24th of March. Due to COVID, we had to cancel the last two Gov events since March 2020. Because of the wait, more youth than ever had wanted to sign up for the Gov conference. Our Gov registration sold out this year in under 4 minutes. So that tells us how important it is to Indigenous youth around BC. This speaks to the importance and the commitment of Indigenous youth to come to an event which is almost a rite of passage for Indigenous youth. So the venue needed to be bigger in order for us to hold the additional amounts of children, which is why we sought to accommodate a larger hotel and this specific hotel. The hotels and venues where we have previously hosted Gathering Our Voices have loved the event and have always complimented us about how respectful the youth are within their hotels. Our usual Lower Mainland group of hotels was not available to accommodate these high numbers because we've got 1,000 youth. So we've also got their guardians, we've got staff, and we've got volunteers. We take a full year to plan the Gathering Our Voices event. So for us to decide to pull out from the Hyatt Regency Hotel just weeks before it is slated to begin is a serious challenge for us. But we need to protect our youth from the harm of racism. One of our key Gov events is a youth in care dinner, where we surround vulnerable Indigenous youth with love and supports. We really want these youth in particular, who may not have full access to Indigenous culture and community, to feel welcome, to feel a sense of belonging, and to feel loved. They need to see positive responses to who they are as Indigenous youth. This is why it's so important for us to ensure that we're working with the right hotels. Our membership meeting last week was at the Hyatt, and we went there specifically so we could get to know the hotel. We don't normally hold our membership meetings in these large hotels, but we wanted to get a feel for the place and to see the actual physical layout and get to know some of the staff. It's been made clear by the actions of the Hyatt staff and their response to us that they're unable to apply any kind of an Indigenous lens to their work and to this incident. They seem unable to see the harm that they caused was indeed a really negative impact for our team. In their response, they've dismissed hundreds of years of living with stereotyping, racism, and exclusion of Indigenous people. They've determined from their white corporate lens that they were in the right and we were mistaken. Gathering Our Voices is an upstream investment in our Indigenous youth, and it is one of the few upstream investments for mental wellness for Indigenous youth in this province. Many of our young leaders today have attended Gathering Our Voices and made bold and audacious dreams for their future. As an example of this, our president of BC Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centres, Elijah Mack, went to Gathering Our Voices when he was a youth, and he made this bold dream that he wanted to own a couple of restaurants. Well, he does own a couple of restaurants now. He was able to set those goals for himself and achieve those goals. And he's only 26 years old. He's already achieved his dreams. And many of our young leaders are now doctors and lawyers and entrepreneurs. And they credit Gov, the Gathering Our Voices conference, for encouraging them to dream. We've also heard from Indigenous youth who were thinking of ending their lives. They attended Gov as a last act that they thought, and Gov turned around their lives in a positive way. The love, appreciation, and pride in indigeneity is something we work really hard to create at that Gathering Our Voices event. One person can ruin an experience for youth with a negative stereotyping or a racist comment or even a look. This is our fear in staying on with the Hyatt. We don't feel confident the Hyatt can give our youth the experience we are paying for and we are expecting. So what can we do about that? We need to stop stereotyping Indigenous people, and we need to hold people and institutions accountable when they act on their racist beliefs. We must move beyond the denial and minimizing of racism. If we don't confront racism, and when we don't, we are complicit. We are complicit, and silence is acceptance of racism. We need to be more concerned about the impact of racism than what people's motives are. This person was reportedly only doing his job. Really? So his job is to target Indigenous people with his racist beliefs? What was his job? No, this is a hotel, and our cultural advisor was a guest of that hotel. He should be accommodating the guests of the hotel. Why then was our cultural advisor targeted? I want to be clear that BCAAFC does not want the Hyatt Hotel to address this merely as one employee's actions. We want to see all staff trained to understand their biases against Indigenous people, and we want to see measures to ensure systemic racism is addressed throughout the Hyatt organization. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm now going to introduce as well, and thank you for the BC Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centers for giving that strong message in the background that's very necessary so you can understand where we're at today. And as was mentioned, there's a youth conference that's coming up, and this was a deplorable action that happened against our cultural leader, cultural advisor. So I wanted to introduce Katisha Paul, the newly elected Union of BC Indian Chiefs Youth Representative.
Hi, Jessica, for that introduction. Col Sgwel, Antipay, Quilchasas, Katisha Paul, Tanishan at Quetzalcoatl, Statlium, Lummi, Silks, Niel Natanli, Lonnie Riley, Niel Namen, Joseph Paul, Hyatts got Malkwe, Hyatts got Homalkwem, Hyatts got Huamoch, Mistimoch. It's a sad day out there, and that's why we're gathered here today. The Hyatt Regency is in business to provide hospitality, not hostility. Why should we continue asking institutions to treat us as human beings who are worthy and deserving of safety? This organization that you run is amazing. You gather 25 different friendship centers, and you ensure that all urban institutions and areas and settings protect the Indigenous peoples of those areas who have had to leave their own homes to go and find a better economic and social life for their own well-being. To have an elder disrespected in such a way is disgraceful. Shame on you, Hyatt Regency, shame. I went onto the website the other night, and it states that, quote, "The property confirms they are implementing guest safety measures," end quote. Those safety measures need to also include cultural safety protocols and training for all staff. And when I say all staff, I mean every single Hyatt hotel across the world. Make sure that you teach your staff how to treat humans as humans. Learn about who the caretakers of the land are. Learn our history of colonization, residential schools, genocide, assimilation. Learn about the beauty of who we are right now in this very moment. Because if you've seen the beauty that we share, if you've seen our little ones talking in our language that was initially taken away from us, you'd be proud of us. You wouldn't deny us the use of something as simple as a bathroom. We can't continue like this. Gathering our voices is meant to provide a safe space for our leaders, our up-and-coming future. How are we going to walk into that building, 1,000 youth? How are we going to walk in there and feel comfortable? How are kids going to lay their heads down in a bed and feel safe before they go to bed? They shouldn't be thinking of whether or not their rights are going to be denied. They should be thinking about how it is that they're going to learn to be a leader of the future. You're taking away their focus. I'm asking our Indigenous warriors to volunteer for gathering our voices. They need more help. Our warriors need to be there to protect our youth at a conference meant and provided for them a brighter future. We are here. We're never going to leave. So it's time that all of you out there in the world who provide us with care and meant to provide us with hospitality, learn about how to work with us properly. Hyatts, thank you all.
Wait. So this must stop. I've been asked by the First Nations Leadership Council, First Nations leaders in British Columbia. When we heard this news, not only were we dismayed, saddened, angry, but again, it just brought up the trauma again, once again. So we give these land acknowledgements when we're in our traditional territories to remind people where they're standing, where they're doing business, where they're working. And it's so important for the Hyatt International or Hyatt Regency Vancouver to understand that they're on the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And to understand our culture, our language, and our ways, that we put our elders, we raise our elders. And it's so important that people understand that. I think most people do, but it only takes the action of one. The action of one can also spread. There might be a culture that we're unaware of at the Hyatt Regency Vancouver. And so we look for solutions, but we know that anti-Indigenous racism is alive and well. And to do such a thing, to take away such a basic human right from our cultural advisor is wrong. The hotel industries make millions and millions of dollars every year from First Nations, not only here in Vancouver, but throughout British Columbia, Canada, and internationally. They have to see that this is wrong, and they have to do something about it. Time after time, our people face racism, whether it's on the streets, in the justice system, in hospitals, in schools. It's everywhere. And this just highlights what businesses have to do, that they have to set up a policy, a regulation for their staff. There needs to be training so that when incidents like this happen, they know how to respond accordingly. If that doesn't happen, it will happen again, it will happen again, and it will happen again. We're looking for solutions. We're beyond anger. We're trying to find solutions with mainstream and now business such as this hotel. It was just down the street, for goodness sakes, at the Bank of Montreal in the case of Maxwell Johnson and his granddaughter were handcuffed. You think a business that was a block away from that would review its own policies and regulations? Again, it was mentioned that this kind of behavior can lead to something else. And we know since COVID-19, the pandemic, that it's happening more and more. Government and the legal processes have failed. So we call out to the governments. We call out to the legal systems. We call out to industry. We call out to everybody, even those that sit at cafes and restaurants and talk, that if you hear somebody make a racist or prejudice comment, to stand up, to say something. The action of one can also be very positive. We know that there's a colonial root of prejudice and racism here in British Columbia the last 150 years. But we're not going to wait another 150 years to make these changes. We want them to happen now. It has to happen now. And a lot of times we go after the government. We go after the legal system. But industry has to be included in all of this. This just highlights the need for that to happen. So at the upcoming gathering of youth, we want them to be safe. And the solutions that I mentioned, the training is so important. Their policies and regulations have to change. And we have to make sure Indigenous and people of all colors feel safe, and especially for our youth, for our women, for our elders. If that's not going to happen, think about what kind of society that we're in. A lady fell down across the street. No one wanted to go over and help. Had to go over and pick her up. That's the kind of society we're in nowadays. And that has to change. And it starts with you. The power of one can make this change. And I call for you as a champion, whether you're in government, in industry, in any kind of work, wherever you may be, that you make that change. And let's do it together. And we stand by the BC Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centers as the Leadership Council, as an Indigenous leader, as well as a person who was just walking down the street a half an hour ago. You can do that change. So that is the message today. And I appreciate everybody coming together and making an opportunity for us to make this statement, but it's a statement that we want change. And we're not going to go anywhere, as our youth representative has said, and we're here to help, as we have been the last 150 years or more. Cookstown, thank you.
Thank you. We're happy to take questions. Are there any questions here in the room?
Are you pursuing legal options at this point, or thinking about it?
We have had conversations with the Hyatt Hotel. It was never our intention to pursue legal actions on this issue. Our intentions was to try to make the hotel safe. Look, this Gathering Our Voices event is a really big, costly event. It's a $2 million conference for our Indigenous youth. The majority of the funds of the costs go to the actual hotel costs for hotel rooms and the venue costs. So it's a really big, expensive event. We are actually going to be in breach of our contracts now with the Hyatt Hotel, moving our, as much as we can out of the Hyatt for our own concern for safety for our Indigenous youth. So we're not seeking financial compensation about this. We want people to know and to understand that treating Indigenous people, be they our beloved elders or anybody on the street, and especially our Indigenous youth, is unacceptable in this day and age. We are in a nation that speaks to and commits to reconciliation, and we need everybody on board with reconciliation. We need people to understand that it's not acceptable to treat Indigenous people without humanity, to treat them with so little dignity and respect. So at this point, we are moving, gathering our voices as much as we can out of that hotel and seeking other hotels. So the $2 million Gathering Our Voices conference is likely going to cost us $3 million this year because of this incident.
Since the event, what have been your conversations with the Hyatt management? What have you tell them, and what were their answers?
We viewed a video of the event, and they have provided us with a letter. And the letter basically denies that any Indigenous racism took place. They provided a letter to our cultural advisor the very next morning after the event. And it said, in summary, our colleague was only doing his job. Here's a breakfast voucher, and we hope you have a pleasant rest of your stay. So there's been no real commitment. I tried to speak with the general manager on the day after the incident and didn't hear back. All I got was the assistant front desk clerk, and nobody would put me beyond that. And they claimed that they were really trying to reach out to me. And I said, but I'd given you my name, and I hadn't heard from you for a few days. And they said, well, we had some other name. And I was saying, well, I gave you my name and my title. I'm the executive director, and you knew about this incident. So there was almost no response. And so at that point, we made the decision that we felt unable to resolve this, and we made the decision to start seeking other hotels to house the event.
I'm confused about the washroom itself, and was it closed, was it off limits, what was the deal with the washroom to begin with?
The staff person was coming out of the washroom, and we learned later that he was going through them and closing them up. So he was coming out of the men's washroom when our staff person, our cultural leader, was trying to get in, and he asked to be let by 4 times and said, the elevators are slow at the Hyatt, and it was a really busy night there. And our advisor has a medical condition, so needed to use the washroom really urgently. And we had been using these washrooms for the last 3 days. We were very comfortable with, the access on these floors. And so trying to access that washroom and then being denied, and then being smirked at when, they, with the accident, and then finally being let past, eventually was let past to go and use the washroom, but it was too late by then.
And who this employee, was it a janitor, or was it who was the employee?
No, it was neither a janitor nor security, and I'm not sure who it was, but it was an employee of the hotel.
And once again, you were there not for the youth event, or?
That's right. We were there to host our membership meetings. So we have membership meetings a couple of times a year. We bring all of our 25 friendship centers together. We do some training, we celebrate. We bring the Provincial Aboriginal Youth Council together. They were meeting there to go over some final decisions to be made about the Gathering Our Voices conference. That's why we were there. And we specifically chose that hotel because we knew we were using it for gathering our voices, and we wanted to get to know it.
And just to follow up, has the Hyatt given any explanation as to why the staff person was going around and locking the washrooms at this time? Because you said, it sounds like they've been open before and being able to use them?
I think that they were going through, as I said earlier to this gentleman, I think that they were starting to go through a process of closing them for the night.
It's been more than 3 years, I think, since Maxwell Johnson was arrested with his granddaughter. How does it make you feel that you still can't have a conversation with a hotel manager about an event like that 3 years later, and that you have to hold a press conference to have this dealt with, instead of having some processes that would allow you to do it?
It's really frustrating, and it's really challenging, because we know that these events happen all the time. And the challenge for Indigenous people is that we don't report a lot of these events, and often we don't report these events because we're afraid to lose a service. For example, if we report racism in the health sector, we're afraid that we're not going to get any more health services. We also know that there's, there's a good chance we're not going to be believed just because we're Indigenous. And that we're being overly sensitive, or we're reframing this. The one challenge, I think, about racism in Canada is that, mainstream Canadians who've never experienced racism in their life are often the ones that are deciding whether or not we had a racism experience or not. They don't have an Indigenous lens, they don't have a BIPOC lens, but they're determining whether or not, from their perspective or their view, that this is racism. They can't know that. And it's ridiculous, and we're just tired of that. It's time now, and I think it's time for all Indigenous people to stand up and speak about the racism experiences that they're having. One of the things that we're doing at BC Association of Friendship Centers is we're starting to gather racism data from our Indigenous community. We've developed we worked with Dr. Alika Lafontaine, who is the president of the Canadian Medical Association, who built an app that's capturing racism in the health sector. We soft piloted that app over 1 year, and we got 10,000 racism complaints just from the health sector. So we know that and these are just Indigenous specific complaints about racism. So we know that racism is rampant in this province, and we know that we need to change this. And this is the only way to change it, is to come out publicly and talk about the racism that we're experiencing, and talk about how we really need to change, and how we need to protect our Indigenous youth from these kinds of experiences. No one should have to experience racism.
You mentioned financial contracts with the
Yeah.
Hyatt. Are they not being amenable to your wishes to move out much of your event? And are they hanging on to deposits and talking about how they expect you to follow through with those commitments?
We haven't had a financial conversation with the Hyatt. We are working on the assumption that we're in breach of these contracts and that we are moving out. They've not offered to give us a break on these contracts. I did get some notes from the Hyatt that they were really, they did a lot of business with First Nations, and they wanted to keep our business, but they weren't really willing to work with us to address this issue. There's still denial from the Hyatt that racism occurred. So whatever it's going to cost us, it's going to cost us. We need to really stand on principle and make sure that Indigenous people feel safe accessing the Hyatt or any other hotel or anywhere in the corporate sector.
What does it say to you about the Hyatt that they would take away this knowledge keeper's dignity in such a way, and then try to hang on to your money and maintain a business relationship without acknowledging the wrongdoing?
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's hard to fathom, isn't it, that they deny any wrongdoing, but would keep our, gathering our voices contracts. And, that's not something that we're just prepared to assume the losses at this point, because my priority is I am responsible for the safety of 1,000 Indigenous youth. And I could not guarantee it at that hotel at this point.
My final question then is, how is that transition from the Hyatt going? It seems like a logistical challenge.
Yes, it is.
Obviously, it's underway. How is it going? And are you confident that you will be able to put on the conference that you had planned without that venue?
We are in negotiation. We have other hotels that are part of the Gathering Our Voices, and we're continuing. We're trying to move as much of Gathering Our Voices into those other hotels. So the Fairmont Kitty Corner to the Hyatt, for example, was the other hotel that we were using. So we're trying to do as much there, and we're also expanding it to other areas. But at this point, with 2 weeks left to go before the conference, it's a real challenge to make such significant moves for such a big conference.
I do believe that the Hyatt has to do the right thing. It has to do the right thing for not only the friendship centers, but it has to do the right thing for the cultural advisor. A breakfast voucher will not cut it. And so when the legal matters come up or anything, the questions thereof, I'm not going to speak for the cultural advisor, but I do know a breakfast voucher will not cut it. And I'm telling you something else that, suppose this happened to like a relative or someone that you knew very closely. And now we have youth going in there, as what was said. And I do believe that they need to ensure the safety. They need to respond accordingly. And if it means in writing or if it means having their own press release, whatever it may be, they need to respond and let us know very clearly, 1, 2, 3, that this is what they're going to do. The safety of our children is paramount, the youth, as well as what we called for in terms of the training of the individual and their staff, and as well the policy and regulation has to change at the Hyatt. They need to do that, and they need to do it now, and then as well acknowledge the trauma that is caused to the culture advisor, as well as when this news goes out and spreads, what it will bring to our individuals that have suffered so much drama in the last 150 years.
Are you comfortable sharing the age or the age range of the elder, one? And then two, what might cut it? What could the Hyatt do today? Is it, as you suggested, announcing a global training program? What could they do to keep your conference at their location? So one, the age range, and two, what can they do?
The elder in question, or the cultural advisor in question, is actually quite a young man. He's well before his time as an elder, but a deeply respected cultural and spiritual leader. And he's in his early 40s, I believe. Your second question, what can the Hyatt do?
Could they do anything that would give you confidence?
We would have liked them to come and sit here with us and apologize. And, taking into consideration the culture of the Coast Salish people and the people of this land, what we often do as Indigenous people from this area is that there's processes that are fairly similar around Indigenous community, but we apologize. There's often a feast. You saw with the Bank of Montreal feast, that's kind of it's called a shame feast, and the Vancouver Police didn't show up for it, so it doesn't have any closure now for that nation. And so we weren't asking for that. We were asking for them to apologize and commit to do some training with us. And I guess that wasn't agreeable for them.
Were they invited today?
We didn't get very far along in the discussions. I received a formal letter from the Hyatt that was very clear that they found no fault with their employee and how they handled the situation.
Hi, Neil Moore for sharing Daily Lewis Global News. I was just curious, you guys are bringing such a massive cash influx, and at this point, First Nations communities are bringing these cash influxes in. So how does it feel for you guys to be met with this and them to, I guess, you would think in a perfect world they would be scrambling to try and make it right. So I'm just curious, how does it feel for you guys?
Well, I can tell you that our cultural advisor was very, very devastated and very traumatized. And he spent the night in that hotel after that incident, and he was very, you can imagine how much shame this feels. And, you know, as Indigenous people in residential schools, they constantly shamed us for just being who we were. And so, you know, as Robert said, all that trauma returns. And so he was feeling terrible, and he, you know, laid in bed fretting all night about whether he was actually going to tell me or not. Because, he, you know, I mean, we all have our pride, and is this something that we should talk about? So it was a very, very difficult decision for him to make to let me know what happened. I appreciate that he felt safe enough to finally tell me, and you know, I'm committed to making sure that my staff are safe, our entire BC Association team are safe, and also our youth are safe. So, yeah, it was really disappointing to have that experience and to see it. It you know, we all shed some tears. When I say that we shed tears, we shed tears because we've all felt that humiliation before. I don't think there's an Indigenous person here in this province that hasn't felt that kind of humiliation before. And so, you know, we wanted to make sure that we supported. And, you know, I was a bit shocked also. And it took me a few minutes, I have to say, to realize, oh my God, I'm putting on Gathering Our Voices here in a couple of weeks, and how am I going to make it safe? You know, so not only thinking about our staff person who had this terrible experience, but also thinking ahead, and now what are we going to do in such a short period of time? Are there any questions online? Any further questions? Great. Thanks very much.
Thank you.